So good, so good, so good.
Everything you want for summer is at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and up to 60% off. Stock up and save on the brands you love like Vince, Sam Edelman, Frame, and Free People. Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
There's a word you've been reaching for. Let's find out if it fits.
You're listening to Unbound Presents Dangerous Minds. Beth Curry talks about whatever the hell she wants. And this time, what she wants to talk about is psychopaths, narcissists, killers, and the people who made them that way. You asked for it, repeatedly. Here's hoping you can handle it.
Hey there, welcome back to Dangerous Minds. I'm Beth Curry, and yesterday we talked about how dangerous people are made, the biology, the environment, the attachment disruptions, the developmental pathways. Today we're going to get into the actual categories. So this is the episode a lot of you have been waiting for, and I know because you told me. Variations of the same message. I think I was with a narcissist. I think my mom was a psychopath. Someone told me my ex has BPD, and I don't know what that means. Is what happened to me coercive control, or am I overreacting? So I'm going to go through them properly and what they actually are and how they differ, where they overlap, and what it means and doesn't mean to put a label on someone. Okay. I want to say something before we start because it's important. Labels are tools. They're useful when they help you understand something, and they're dangerous when they replace understanding. Okay. I'm going to give you the clinical definitions today because you deserve accurate information, not because I want you to go home and diagnose everyone you've ever disliked. Okay. One of those things is useful. The other one is just a dinner party. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is the primary diagnostic reference used in clinical and forensic psychology, organizes personality disorders into clusters. So there's cluster A, which includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal disorders. There's cluster B, which is the one we're mostly interested in today, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic, and cluster C, which includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders. So I covered avoidant personality disorder briefly in part 1. The person I knew whose history made that diagnosis make complete sense. Today we're living in cluster B, which is not coincidentally where most of the forensic literature on dangerous behavior is concentrated. A few important caveats before we go any further. First, personality disorders exist on a spectrum. Okay. Nobody presents as a textbook case. Real people are messier than diagnostic criteria, right? And most clinicians are working with presentations that tick some boxes and not so much the others, or they sit between categories, or, that shift over time, whatever. Second, a diagnosis is not a verdict either. It's not a clinical description of a pattern. It does not tell you what someone will do. It does not tell you they're irredeemable, and it does not tell you that they're dangerous. Okay. What it tells you is that a particular pattern of thinking and feeling and relating to others is sufficiently stable and sufficiently impairing that it warrants a clinical name. Okay. Third, and I do want to be clear about this, you cannot diagnose someone you have not assessed. I know, but I'm saying it anyway. And what you can do in this instead is recognize patterns, and that's what we're going to talk about. I've had this conversation so many times. Someone comes to me and describes a relationship, and by the end of the description, I'm thinking, yes, that sounds like a very recognizable pattern for sure. But then I have to gently explain that what I can offer them is a framework, not a diagnosis. I don't do diagnoses. Diagnosing someone who isn't even in the room isn't forensic psychology. It's guessing with credentials, and the framework is still useful. That's why we're here. So, I'm going to start with psychopathy, okay? Because it is simultaneously the most researched and the most misunderstood personality construct in the field. So it is not currently a formal DSM diagnosis. It's a clinical construct, most commonly measured using the Hare psychopathy checklist, which was developed by Canadian psychologist Robert Hare, and it overlaps significantly with antisocial personality disorder, but they're not the same thing. So we'll get into that distinction in a second. Psychopathy is characterized by a specific constellation of traits like interpersonality, grandiosity, superficial charm, pathological lying, manipulation, a complete lack of remorse. Effectively, it's shallow emotional responses, callousness, failure to accept responsibility. And this is the one that tends to stop people, a fundamental inability to feel empathy in the way that neurotypical people do. And then behaviorally, there's impulsivity and poor behavior controls, a need for stimulation, and a history of antisocial behavior. So the Hare psychopathy checklist scores individuals on a scale of 0 to 40. A score of 30 or above is generally considered indicative of psychopathy in research contexts. And the average score in the general population is around 4. The average score in incarcerated populations is around 22. So that might tell you something. The thing that trips people up is the charm. I talked about this before. Psychopathic individuals are frequently described by people who knew them before things went wrong as magnetic, engaging, the most interesting person in the room. And that's not really an accident. Psychopathy, particularly at the higher functioning end, involves a very sophisticated capacity for social mimicry. They learn what warmth looks like and they learn what empathy sounds like. They don't have it. They learn it, right? And they perform it extremely well until they don't need to anymore, of course. And this is the part where I always want to stop and say, if you're sitting there thinking that sounds exactly like someone I know, I hear you. And I want you to sit with that for a second without immediately either dismissing it or making a huge catastrophe out of it, because recognition is the first step, right? So what you do with it is a different conversation, and that's one that we'll get to. The other thing worth knowing about psychopathy is the distinction between primary and secondary psychopathy. So primary is understood to be kind of more neurologically based. The reduced amygdala reactivity. There's structural differences in the prefrontal cortex that we talked about last episode. These individuals tend to be cool and calculated and low anxiety. They're not distressed by their own behavior. They're not conflicted. They just simply don't experience the emotional friction that would normally create conflict, right? And then the secondary psychopathy involves similar behavioral patterns, but is understood to be more environmentally driven, like emerging from severe trauma or neglect or that attachment disruption. These individuals often do experience anxiety and emotional dysregulation. Their callousness is more defensive than anything else. They learned not to feel because feeling was too dangerous. The difference between those two, I think, matters clinically because it affects prognosis, right? And it matters humanly because it affects how you understand someone's history as well. Antisocial personality disorder is the DSM diagnosis that most closely maps onto what people mean when they say psychopath, but they're not interchangeable, okay? It's worth understanding the difference here. ASPD is diagnosed based primarily on behavior. The criteria include a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. Presence since age 15 indicated by things like repeated criminal acts, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, aggressiveness, reckless disregard for the safety of others, consistent irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. That kind of stuff. Psychopathy, by contrast, is diagnosed based on personality traits, including those affective features like shallow emotion and a lack of empathy, not just behavior. The practical result is that all psychopaths would likely meet criteria for ASPD, but not all people with ASPD are psychopaths. In fact, studies suggest that only about a third of incarcerated individuals with ASPD score in the psychopathic range on the Hare checklist. But why does this matter, Beth? Because ASPD, particularly when it's secondary, when it's emerged primarily from environmental factors rather than neurological ones, has a somewhat different treatment picture, okay? And because lumping everyone with ASPD into the same damn category as high-scoring primary psychopaths leads to a very inaccurate set of assumptions about dangerousness and treatability and what someone is actually capable of, right? And I'll be honest, the conflation of ASPD and psychopathy in pop culture, it drives me slightly mad, not because the distinction is pedantic, but because it has real consequences, for how people are treated in forensic settings and how juries might understand evidence and how families understand what they're dealing with, right? Words matter, especially these ones. Now, narcissistic personality disorder, this is the most misused label in the lexicon, right? Narcissism. I just want to take a breath here because this word has been so thoroughly misused in the past decade that it has almost lost clinical utility in public conversation. Okay? Everyone's ex is a narcissist now. Every difficult boss and every demanding family member. And while I understand the impulse completely, finding a word for a painful experience is genuinely useful, as I said in part 1. The inflation of this term has created some real big problems. So I think we need to reset. Narcissistic personality disorder, clinically, is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, beginning in early adulthood and present across contexts. So the DSM criteria include a grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success or power or brilliance, a belief that they're special and unique and can only be understood by other high-status people. There's a need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, interpersonal exploitation, lack of empathy, envy of others or belief that others envy them, an arrogant or haughty behavior. 5 of those 9 criteria need to be present for a diagnosis. Now, here's the thing that people often miss about narcissism, and I think it's the most important thing I will say in this part of the episode. The grandiosity is a defense. So underneath the inflated self-presentation, the entitlement, the contempt for others, in the vast majority of narcissistic presentations, is a profound fragility. It's a self-esteem that is simultaneously enormous and completely hollow. Make sense? The narcissistic personality structure is, at its core, built around protecting a self that feels fundamentally inadequate from ever having to confront that inadequacy, which is why narcissistic injury, any perceived slight or criticism or challenge to their self-image produces this crazy response that is completely disproportionate to the trigger. Because it isn't really about the trigger. It's about the thing underneath that the trigger momentarily exposed. This doesn't make the behavior acceptable, but it makes it comprehensible, and comprehensible is useful, as I say. And I want to make a distinction here, too. I think might be genuinely helpful. There's a difference between someone who has narcissistic traits, and most people have some. It's a spectrum. And someone with actual narcissistic personality disorder. The former might be self-absorbed, difficult, occasionally infuriating, probably every influencer on the planet. But the latter is organized around a fundamentally different relationship to other people. Perhaps this just includes a portion of influencers. One in which other people exist primarily as mirrors or as threats. So that's a different thing, okay? And if you've been in a relationship with the latter, you probably already know it felt different, because it was. There's also an important distinction between grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism that I think is underappreciated in popular discussion. Grandiose narcissism is what most people picture, that loud, entitled, domineering presentation, contemptuous for sure, openly self-aggrandizing. It's crazy. So there's that. It's loud. And then vulnerable narcissism is quieter and in many ways harder to identify. These individuals tend to present as hypersensitive and easily wounded and chronically aggrieved. They don't trumpet their specialness. They quietly insist on it, and they experience any failure to recognize it as a profound injustice. They can present as victims while functioning as perpetrators, which makes them particularly difficult to navigate. Both presentations involve the same core dynamics. The packaging is just different. Next, I'm going to talk about borderline personality disorder. I'm going to spend some real time here, I think, because I think BPD is one of the most stigmatized and most misunderstood and most unfairly maligned diagnoses in the entire DSM. And I kind of want to push back on some of that. BPD is characterized by pervasive instability in mood or self-image or relationships, maybe behavior. The core features include frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, pattern of intense and unstable relationships that maybe alternates between idealization and devaluation. There could be identity disturbance or impulsivity, recurrent self-harm or suicidal behavior, emotional instability, chronic feelings of emptiness, intense and episodic anger, and transient paranoid ideation or dissociation under stress. I think I've covered it all. When this diagnosis appears in forensic or true crime contexts, it is almost always framed as dangerous. Like it's synonymous with volatility and threat. And I want to be direct about this. The research does not support that framing at all, okay? People with BPD are significantly more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of it. They are at extremely high risk of self-harm and suicide. They are a population in profound pain. The behaviors that read as threatening, like the rage or the instability or the intensity, are almost always expressions of unbearable internal distress, not predatory intent. And that is a fundamental difference, kids. And conflating it with psychopathy or predatory narcissism is not just inaccurate, it causes direct harm to people who are already among the most vulnerable in any clinical population. I feel strongly about this one, strongly enough that I'm going to say it plainly. The way BPD is talked about in true crime and pop psychology spaces, as though it's a synonym for dangerous or manipulative or toxic, is wrong. It's stigmatizing, and it contributes to a culture where people who are desperately in need of support are instead treated as threats, right? If someone in your life has BPD, what they need, like what actually helps, and the research is clear on this, is consistency and clear boundaries and a therapeutic relationship built around something called dialectical behavior therapy, which was specifically developed for this population. Not avoidance and not labels. Support. Now, is there a version of BPD presentation that can involve behaviors that harm others? Yes, absolutely. The intensity of emotional dysregulation, particularly in attachment relationships, can produce behavior that's frightening and damaging to partners and family members. The idealization devaluation cycle, sometimes called splitting, can be genuinely destabilizing for people close to someone with BPD. But the intent, it's not predatory. Okay, the experience isn't cold. It's the opposite of cold. It's a person who feels everything at maximum volume all the livelong day with almost no ability to turn it down. And that is a very different clinical and human picture from psychopathy, and it deserves to be treated as such. Now, emotional violence, this is a category without a diagnosis, and I want to spend the last part of this episode because I think the gap that leaves the most people without language for their experience, they're in this one, okay? Emotional violence is not a DSM diagnosis. It's a pattern of behavior. It's one that can occur in individuals with any of the above diagnoses or in individuals with no formal diagnosis at all. And it is, in many ways, the most common form of harm that people experience in close relationships. Emotional violence includes sustained criticism and contempt, gaslighting, humiliation, isolation, threats, withholding, and the deliberate manipulation of someone's reality to make them doubt their own perceptions. The word deliberate is doing a lot of the work in that sentence because not all harmful emotional behavior is deliberate. So someone with BPD in the middle of an emotional storm is not running a calculated campaign. Someone with a highly narcissistic personality structure who consistently dismisses their partner's needs is operating from a more organized self-interest. Okay. Someone with psychopathic traits who systematically dismantles their partner's support network and sense of reality is doing something else again, something that in a legal context we would call coercive control. We're going to spend an entire episode on that tomorrow. The distinction matters because it affects how you understand what happens to you and how you respond to it. Okay. I've spoken to so many people over the years who spent years, sometimes decades, wondering if what happened to them counted, because they were in these situations, but there were no bruises, and in public, everything looked fine. And I don't know, because they'd been told repeatedly and convincingly that they were the problem. And the thing I want to say to those people directly, if you're listening, it counted. Emotional violence is real violence. The absence of a physical mark doesn't make the damage less at all. The neuroscience, in fact, of chronic emotional abuse shows changes in brain structure and function that are indistinguishable from those caused by physical trauma. So, your nervous system does not care about the distinction between them, doesn't care. It just knows it was under threat. So, where does that leave us? With a spectrum, a wide, complicated, overlapping spectrum of personalities, patterns, and presentations, some of which emerge primarily from neurology, some from environment, but most, I think, from the collision of both, some of which involve predatory intent and some which involve profound suffering and some of which involve both at the same time. None of which are simple, none of which are mapped neatly onto the villain archetypes we've been given by television and true crime and all that, right? But all of which are worth understanding properly, because I think understanding properly is how you stop reaching for the wrong word and start finding the right one, right? So next time, tomorrow, part 3, we're moving into behavior, specifically predatory behavior, stalking, coercive control, the escalation patterns that forensics risk assessment is designed to identify, what it looks like from the inside, the outside, what the research tells us about when and why it escalates. This will be the episode where my forensic background is going to be most visible and where some of what I've hinted at in the last 2 episodes personally is going to become a bit clearer. Thanks for listening. If you want to support the show, production costs, or the time it takes for me to research and develop these shows for you, info's in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and share these episodes on your social media or with your friends. It all makes a big difference to me. Thanks so much. I'll see you tomorrow.
That's Dangerous Minds Unbound Off Script for people with slightly concerning taste in podcasts. Unbound is free to listen to. Show notes have everything you need if you want to support the show or get in touch with Beth. Thanks for listening. Probably says something about you that you made it this far. We mean that as a compliment.